Okay, I think we're moving to the preview of the governor's executive budget proposal. I'm assuming that's you as well. Take it away.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Again, good evening. Thank you for this opportunity to present to you just a high-level overview of the executive budget proposal for next fiscal year. This is a budget proposal that was released by the governor on February 8th. And the executive budget proposal is based on those revenue estimates that were revealed and arrived at consensus on at the Revenue Estimating Conference back in January. The House and Senate will be releasing their budget proposals also. We look forward to those a little bit later in the spring, perhaps April or May, is when those are typically revealed. But on the first slide, it's not meant to be legible, but just a reminder of our budget development timeline that we have reviewed at a previous board meeting as well. And mostly just to demonstrate that this is still very early in the process as we begin to understand and formulate the factors that will be considered as we develop next year's budget. And in fact, it also, as I mentioned with the Revenue Estimating Conference, it informs this year's budget somewhat as well too. But the governor's proposal primarily looks forward to the next fiscal year. So on to the next slide. There are primary themes that we saw in the release of this budget proposal. Those include the foundation allowance and the weighted student funding model is continued in this budget proposal. The foundation allowance provides for the bulk of our operating money in our general fund. It's what we fund teaching and learning with, staff salaries, anything that goes into our classrooms, custodial work, transportation. All of our day-to-day operations are funded in the general fund, and the foundation allowance is what provides for that funding. Another theme is student well-being. Dollars earmarked for that purpose and initiatives. Significant earmarks for academic supports and early childhood programs. And then educator workforce supports is a theme in her budget this year, as well as infrastructure and a rainy day fund. So as we look into those topics a little more closely, foundation allowance and weighted funding. The foundation allowance is proposed in this budget to increase by 5% for fiscal year 24. That's an increase over the current target foundation allowance amount of $458 per pupil, and that's a significant increase. The budget proposal continues a methodology of weighted funding for certain populations of students and certain programming that may be more costly. So at-risk funding for English learning programs, and then even funding for rural districts and ISDs all have funding increase proposals of a 5% increase. And there are changes to the special education funding formula. Special education is funded according to a formula of enrolled students and a special type of foundation allowance, and then some special education cost reimbursements. So together with the foundation allowance, the weighted funding increases, and the potential funding changes in special education, that could amount to an amount of $8.3 million of increased revenues for the Ann Arbor Public Schools. Other themes in the budget proposal, funding for student well-being. We see some new funding being earmarked for universally free student meals, breakfasts, and lunches. And I believe this has been compelled by the fact that we had those free meals last year, increased participation. We saw students enjoying those free breakfasts and meals every day. And it does assist those families who might just be on the cusp of maybe not being able to qualify for those free or reduced price meals. So this absolutely contributes to student well-being with nutritious meals and being ready to learn each day. There's also monies earmarked to eliminate school meal debt. In our schools, every day there are families who cannot afford meals, and although they strive to pay for those, maybe they don't qualify for the free or reduced price meals. Sometimes they do charge those meals with every intention to reimburse that and get through the weeks and the months, but sometimes we do carry some debt for student meals on our books. So the potential funding for the Ann Arbor Public Schools really can't be determined at this time because it depends on what those funding models look like, what schools and students may be eligible for that elimination of the school debt. It also depends a little bit on how the state budget might coordinate with the federal funding. But we know that all in all, that is a good program for Ann Arbor Public Schools to have those free meals universally available. There's also continued funding for mental health initiatives and school safety like we are seeing this year. We anticipate that those would be one-time funds in coordination with this year's funding. So overall, potential funding for the Ann Arbor Public Schools in this theme of student well-being could amount to a potential $3.6 million for our district. And then funding for academic supports in early childhood education. We see some initiatives for expanded funding to support adult education pilots, literacy coaches, math intervention programs, tutoring. She mentioned a program called My Kids Back on Track, and funding for before and after school programs that have an educational or an enrichment type of factor to those programs. And then expanded Great Start Readiness Program, also called GSRP program. The GSRP funding is a mechanism to continue to expand on her priority of universally available preschool, pre-K programming. So the GSRP is going to be proposed to expand by expanding access to families with higher income eligibility thresholds, as well as startup grants and program expansion grants for providers. And here in the Ann Arbor Public Schools, we do participate in the Great Start Readiness program, so we anticipate being able to be a part of those fundings, those available funds. And then, interestingly, some funding earmarked for transportation or busing reimbursements to transport children to those programs. So another area of focus in this budget proposal is educator recruitment and retention, continuing and new programs in order to address the educator shortage. Things like the Michigan Future Educator Fellowship, which we're looking forward to learning more about, the student teacher stipends, new teacher mentoring programs, early childhood educator recruitment, and rural educator credentialing hubs. For those districts that are spaced far apart, they want to create some hubs to assist those districts. And then special education service training for school administrators so that school administrators can understand the best way to legally and best practices provide those special education services in their schools. Other themes, funding for school infrastructure. There's allocations for school infrastructure projects, and it appears that there will be a statewide facilities study, similar to the facilities condition assessment that we did in the Ann Arbor Public Schools to understand the condition of the facilities, understanding the deterioration, and perhaps prioritize those facilities in that way. Of course, that remains to be seen how that will come about. Yet, funding for school infrastructure projects once they complete a study of school facilities statewide. There are matching grants for electric school transportation vehicle purchases, as well as some monies for consolidation and incentives for school districts to combine certain support services, such as finance departments, HR, grant administration, technology. Those kinds of support services are being funded with different incentives in this budget proposal. And then we see some funding for earmarked reserves for the Michigan Public School Employees Retirement System for unforeseen costs, and then an establishment of a new rainy day fund, which will offset budget reductions in years where there's negative revenue growth at the state level, so that there can be support to properly fund schools with a rainy day fund that would have periodic deposits. So those are the primary themes of the budget proposals. So what does that mean in the Ann Arbor Public Schools? What are our next steps? As I mentioned, in April and May, we will look forward to reviewing those House and Senate budget proposals. In May, we will attend the next Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference at the state of Michigan. And then as those results of the revenues estimates and the House and Senate proposals become known, those will all factor into a consensus budget proposal where the state of Michigan and the House and the Senate will arrive at consensus and put forth that budget proposal. So we will review that and understand how that will influence funding for the Ann Arbor Public Schools. And then by law, by June 30, the Board of Education must adopt a budget for the following school year. So we will recommend budgets both for the original budget for next school year, but also an amended budget for this current school year for your review and recommendation for adoption. So that is just a very high-level overview of some of the themes and the highlights of the governor's executive budget proposal for next fiscal year. And I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Do any trustees? Yeah. Trustee Schmidt.
So, Gretchen, the governor's budget is the beginning, as you mentioned, and now there's the fight amongst the House and the Senate and her to try to come to some conclusion. And this is the time where the community and different organizations, whether it be the administrative groups, teachers unions, et cetera, they have people that are working in the Capitol to try to, make the point of what's important. So we, as elected officials, should also use our voices. And I was just on the site for the Michigan House of Representatives or the Senate. You can look at who's the chair of appropriations, and it's very appropriate for you to send a note to that person, tell them what's important to you, how important, continuing to raise that funding allowance, or any other particular things that were mentioned in this report that you hope stays in the governor's budget, because many times she won't have something and they'll say, well, she missed it, and they'll add something, or they'll look at hers and say, nah, we don't want that. So this is a time where you can have your voice heard, and I'd highly encourage you to do so.
Thank you, Trustee Schmidt. Are there any other comments or questions? Thank you, Ms. Minnick. Thank you very much.